Hi, I'm Dave Blumhorst. I am a lifelong student of consciousness, both academically, experientially. So just think of me as obsessed with what consciousness is, who we are, that sort of thing. Today, I want to present a short version of a consciousness formula. This is really a framework I created to try to boil down what consciousness is to what the most simplistic formula I can is. And it's going to challenge a couple of key intuitions that we have. First, we tend to believe that we are living in a physical world, a physical reality. I can knock on my table, it's solid, it feels physical, so therefore I must be in a physical reality. A second intuition is that who I am emerges out of that physical reality, that I am this brain, this body, and my consciousness just emerges from the complexity of my brain and body. Two things that a lot of people, even in science and philosophy, still assume today, but is getting more and more challenged, especially the last 20 years or so. There's so much research around this in both science and philosophy. There's mysticism we can go into, which I will. I want to make this a lot simpler and put it into something that is understandable, digestible, a lot more easily. So I came up with a 4-statement framework, formula, as I call it, that I think encapsulates some of this newest thinking and a lot of the experience of it. And those 4 statements are as follows. First, you are the subject of your experience. Second, that subjectivity, consciousness, is universal. Third, therefore, we are universal consciousness. And 4, all else is content. 4 simple statements that may sound very radical. I'm going to go into it in this short version from 2 perspectives. First, I'm going to take the spiritual perspective and talk about how mystics have viewed this. And then second, I'll go into how we look at it from a philosophy and science perspective. Not going to give a lot of backing material in here. I want to keep this short so that you get the flow and understand how the spirituality, how the mysticism, but when we get into philosophy and science, understand how the flow of the logic goes. So you understand why this is probably the best way to look at consciousness. So let's get started. I'll start with the spiritual view. You are the subject of your experience. This defines what consciousness is. We are not this body, this brain. If you look inside, if you go and meditate inside, you have this sense of being, this sense of I am. That is who, from a mystical standpoint, that is who we really are. That sense of I am. And we can just keep it that simple. We're the sense of I am. Let's dig down a little further. And this is why we end up thinking consciousness is universal. As we meditate, and we start meditating on who am I, we start dropping things from the who am I. We typically might say things like, if I go back to my former career, I am a corporate executive. I am a golfer. I am a husband. I am a father. We have all these things that we are. If you just stop at the I am and cut off all these things we are, right? We know we're not those things. We perform those jobs. We experience those things, but that's not who we are. We're actually the one having the experience of being a father, having the experience of playing golf, right? We also have an experience of having a body. We have an experience of having a brain. We have an experience of having thoughts. What really happens is we try to start eliminating all those things so we can get down to just the I am part. And a funny thing happens as you get down to just the I am part. When you discard who we think we are, when you discard our story, our history of ourself, when you discard this physical body and brain, when you get down to just the raw sense of being, something interesting happens. The sense of personal self dissolves. It goes away. Because you then get rid of, say, I am David, or I am Mary, or I am John, or whoever your name is, because the name goes away too. And at some point, the sense of self actually goes away. When that sense of self goes away, and you're just resting in the sense of beingness, another odd thing happens in the experiential mystical world. As the barrier of my individual self dissolves, the whole universe seems to open up. And suddenly I feel like everything, everywhere, there's a oneness that comes over people who reach this stage of meditation. And that oneness is profound, and it is universal. And that is why we say in the mystical world, consciousness is universal. We are universal. If that is so, if the self is an illusion made of stories and what we tell ourselves about our body and brains, and when that goes away, we start feeling this oneness, then that means our identity shifts. It shifts from being a person to being universal consciousness. So therefore, we are universal consciousness. That third statement. Now that we're there, let's look at the fourth statement. All else is content. When we come out of that sense of just being oneness, feel that identity shift inside from personal to universal, and then open our eyes again to look at the world, all we see around us is ourselves. If I look at someone else, and I see someone looking through their eyes, I realize that's me looking back at me through my own eyes as universal consciousness. If I look at the body and brain, I go, that's actually something that is occurring, that I'm experiencing within my consciousness. Everything I experience within my consciousness, and my consciousness is universal. Therefore, that physical world I experience is an experience within consciousness, as opposed to being an actual physical world out there that is impinging on my consciousness. Everything is occurring within consciousness. It's almost like I'm a witness looking at a movie screen, and the screen is playing out the play of the universe. And I realize that I am actually the witness seeing this all unfold. And it's all just unfolding within my consciousness. Therefore, everything that occurs is the contents of consciousness. All else is conscious. All else is content. That's a brief way of looking at the mystical view of consciousness. I think when you look at the mystics of the world, the most direct path to seeing that is a practice called non-duality, Advaita Vedanta in Hinduism, non-duality, which takes this very direct path of questioning who am I until you get down to the I am oneness. Let's shift now. That's all well and good. Is there any philosophy and science to back this up? Where are we going there? Now, like I said, the current mainstream view of philosophy and science is that there is a physical world, it evolves, and consciousness emerges from that physical world as a trait that especially we as humans view because of our complex brains and neurology systems and all that kind of stuff. There was a philosopher named David Chalmers that said there's a hard problem in consciousness here. There are some easy problems. Our brain produces thoughts. We can find these neural correlates. If I stimulate this part of the brain, I experience sadness. If I experience this part of the brain, I can no longer see, if I stimulate this part of the brain. And there are various ways we can stimulate the brain to come up with what are called neural correlates. The problem with neural correlates is they aren't necessarily causative. And even the neuroscientists don't say they know that they're causative. They just know that certain brain states correlate with certain reported experiential states. And David Chalmers said, those are the easy problems. The hard problem is, why is there something it feels like to see red? Why is there something it feels like to be out in the sunshine and feel the warmth of the sun? Why is water wet? Why do we have all these qualities of experience? It's not necessary. You could think through an evolutionary process that creates exactly what a human being is today, and it could operate on all those instincts, the brain working, all this stuff without ever feeling a thing. So why is there something it is like to be us? There's very widespread agreement that we have not solved this problem. Even philosophers that say it's an emergent property of the physical world say, that's my theory, I can't prove it. And the ones that say everything is conscious, that's my theory, I can't prove it. It is a problem that has, by agreement, has not been solved. Why it's called the hard problem of consciousness. So let's take a look at this from those 4 statements again. First, you are the subject of your experience. This basically says consciousness is real. It's the one thing I actually know. I experience the world with my consciousness. Everything else I know, whether it's I learned it in school and math, I studied physics, I studied biology, all that came through to me through my senses and through my consciousness. So I know my consciousness. Therefore, consciousness must be real. And we will define that now as there is something it feels like to be me, the hard problem. That's what we are tackling here. So we're not the objects of our experience. We're not the body and the brain. We're not the, I'm playing golf and the golf clubs. We're none of that. Those are things we experience. Those are objects of experience. We are the one having the experience. So that correlates well with statement number 1. You are the subject of your experience. Statement number 2, consciousness is universal. How do we tackle that one? Neuroscientists will tell you that your idea of being an individual sense is a bit of an illusion. We craft that from our history. We look at our past, we create a story. I went to school, I got a job as a management person. I eventually went to executive life. I take this whole story and create a narrative of me. I join that with what I want to do in the future. I'm retired now, so I want to play golf and go travel and stuff like that. And we craft this whole story about who I am. That story lives in our heads. There's nothing solid to it. You could take away that story and you would cease to see an individual self. So neuroscience basically says, you're not the individual you think you are. Just like we found back in the mystical part. You are not the individual you think you are. Okay, then who am I? Let's drill down to that next statement. Consciousness is universal. Oh, I did that already. We are not the individuals we think we are. So let's keep going. Now let's look at physics. Physics tells us of another hard problem, a hard problem of physics, if you will. It's the explanatory gap between the quantum world and the physical world of particles and objects that we understand today. Part of that explanatory gap comes from what we call the measurement problem. So in the quantum world, we have a bunch of subatomic particles that sit in subatomic fields, and they can occupy what's called a superposition, many things, many places at once, many locations and states at once. And those only become solid particles we can measure definitively when we observe them. So the quantum world is one of fuzzy probabilities, and when we decide to observe them, we get solid particles that we can actually work with. So the explanatory gap is, how do I get from a fuzzy quantum world to the classical world of objects? And the experiments tell us observation is what collapses the wave function to give us a solid world. Physicists try to get around this because this essentially says, wait a minute, consciousness is involved here in getting across that explanatory gap. So they come up with things like the many worlds theory. Hey, how about if every time I make an observation, all those possibilities actually exist in all sorts of alternate universes, and I just happen to be viewing this one at random? And that's how we proceed, which means there's an infinite number of branching worlds everywhere. And we just happen to be experiencing one. It's like everything everywhere all at once. The problem with this is, A, it can't be proven. There's no way to make an observation of an alternate universe. So it's not testable. It's not, as science would say, falsifiable. The math works, And so a lot of physicists say, I like the many worlds interpretation because I can make math work and I don't need consciousness. Why throw out consciousness? It's kind of like when we thought that the planets and the sun went around the earth because we see them rise in the east and set in the west. They must be going around the earth. And Galileo said, and actually Copernicus first said, no, how about if the sun is in the center and we're all going around the sun? And a bunch of physicists, a bunch of people then said, maybe the orbits have these little loops in them. We can create all these different things to explain why the orbits aren't perfect as they go around and make these little retrograde loops. So let's do that. And of course, it was proven that no, the sun is at the center and all the planets go around it, and that's the simple explanation, and it works. We're kind of at one of those paradigm shifts now, and there are scientists starting to say this too. It's like, so what if we took consciousness as fundamental? We don't need all this fancy math and wild theories like many worlds to get there. We can just say, if consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, then the observation is part of the universe that collapses the wave function we get across the explanatory gap. So the last 20 years or so, science has been heading more and more and more that way. In another episode, I'll get into more detail on what they've done there. Mainstream science still wants to say it's physical, but there's a lot of physicists starting to say, what if consciousness is fundamental? And a lot of philosophers saying the same thing. If that is so, consciousness can no longer be an emergent property of matter. In a sense, consciousness comes first. So the observation can happen so that we can get to matter. So if we need conscious observation for matter to emerge, then instead of consciousness emerging from matter, how about if matter emerges from consciousness? And since we know consciousness directly through our own experience, and we don't know the physical world directly through our own experience, we actually have our senses, our eyes, our ears, our nose. We sense all this stuff, and we assume that what we're getting sensorially is a physical world. It's sensations. And neuroscientists will tell you we did not develop those sensations to give us a true picture of reality. We developed those sensations, those senses, to allow us to survive and thrive. It's an evolutionary thing, not a real thing. So wouldn't it make more sense then to say consciousness is what's fundamental, and the physical world emerges from consciousness? And if we are not individuals, and consciousness is fundamental, then consciousness must also be universal. It's a universal property. It's the universal fundamental core, the base of reality. Therefore, consciousness is the fundamental ground from which the universe emerges. So therefore, we're not individuals. We are conscious. Consciousness is universal. We must be universal consciousness. The subject looking through my eyes and the subject looking through your eyes is the exact same subject. We're all one inside, looking through all these different eyes. So why then can't I read your mind? Why is this one subject not seeing all minds at once? There's several proposals on this. The best metaphor for it I have found is in a philosophy called Analytic Idealism by Bernardo Castro. And he talks about something called an alter. In psychology, we know something called multiple personality disorder. I'm sure you've heard of it. There are people that they are one person at one time, and then it flips, and they have a whole different personality that knows nothing of the first personality. It's a known thing called dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality syndrome in psychology. And you can have many personalities that know nothing of each other in one body, presenting at different times. It's an amazing thing. There is also something that happens when that is somehow magically cured. There are some people who recover from this. And when they do, they are one person inside that one body again. And interestingly, they remember everything from all those personalities. It all unifies once those alters collapse. Bernardo Castro proposes, what if our individualness isn't really individualness, it's alters of a universal consciousness? There's regions formed within consciousness, ripples in consciousness. Mystics would say you have an ocean and there are waves in the ocean. The waves are the activity of the ocean. They are not their own individual thing. And they can see the other waves in the ocean. That is what another person looks like to us, another wave. Bernardo proposes another thing. There's a river and whirlpools form in this river. The whirlpools are still made of the same water. One whirlpool can see another whirlpool, but it doesn't see inside of it. And when the whirlpool ends, it collapses, it goes back to being part of the river. This is a really good way to look at why we feel like individuals, even though we know we are not. There's these boundaries within consciousness that kind of separate us off, even though we're not separate. And you would expect there might be some leaks in those boundaries. Maybe every now and then you can read somebody's mind. And there are experiments that have been done on things like telepathy and the like to get there. I'll go into all that in another spot. But the idea here is we're still universal consciousness. And there are altars within universal consciousness that allow us to experience the world through the senses of these altars. That's kind of what it's there for. We can experience the universe through all these different windows of consciousness, all these different portals of consciousness. So if that is true, then what does that say about what is real out there? And that gets to our fourth statement, right? All else is content. If consciousness is fundamental and brings forth the solid physical world, then the physical world is really a perception within consciousness. This is a philosophy called idealism. It's as old as Plato. If you think of Plato and the allegory of the caves, where people are watching a cave wall and there's shadows all over the cave wall being made by someone in the background, and they assume the shadows are what's reality because that's all they can see. They're not allowed to turn around and see what's going on. Idealism is that. And we're saying a kind of the same thing, except, if you want a more modern viewpoint of it, replace the shadows on the cave wall with a screen, with actors and objects and all these things appearing on the screen of consciousness that we are, as universal consciousness, watching, that we are participating in through all these characters that we are playing that we see moving around on the screen. And just like that, we have come back to exactly where the mystics went, which is we're all one consciousness experiencing a universe, just like a witness watching a screen. And that's how you get there through philosophy and science. I'm going to leave you with that. Remember the four statements. You are the subject of your experience. Subjectivity, consciousness is universal. Therefore, we are universal consciousness. And with all that, it must be that all else is contents of consciousness. All else is content. That's the short version. Thank you very much.